Students, so hello again, welcome to this week's lecture. So we're going to be talking today about this week's lesson is going to be on Marxist theory continued, and then a little bit about Zora Neale Hurston's short story Sweat. So again, if you just follow along with the PowerPoint, again, nothing that I'm going to be delivering here isn't in the PowerPoint, but it might just help you if I give a little bit more detail on some of the aspects of each slide. So last lecture we looked at Marxist theory and we drafted, we had a drafting exercise for assignment 2A. So really that's kind of what I want you to focus on for the rest of this week and the next. Assignment 2A, the annotations. This lecture we're going to be talking about Zora Neale Hurston's fantastic short story Sweat. So that's your reading for this week, the short story Sweat. This is the text that I really want you to get into. We're going to think about how it's a Marxist text in many ways. Now, Zora Neale Hurston, absolutely fascinating figure. If you turn to slide 4, you'll see a little bit of a bio there about her. I've put that she was born in Alabama. Now, this is actually this is controversial to say the least. We do have evidence to suggest that she was born in Eatonville in Florida, but it's up for debate. You know, it's not, we don't really have anything kind of proved definitively. And what we think we know is often contradictory. So just something to be aware of there. She was a fantastically talented, phenomenal young black female writer. She came to prominence in the 1910s and 20s. For this reason, we often associate her with the modernist movement, but she certainly doesn't represent modernism's kind of canonical white male structures. She's kind of everything that modernism was not in some ways. Of course, what she did in kind of contributing writing like this is she kind of changed what we think of as modernist writing. So did modernism just have to be written by people like T.S. Eliot or James Joyce or Gertrude Stein? No. People like Zora Neale Hurston could write modernist texts. Now, her mother died in 1904. She had a very difficult home life, joined a traveling theatre company, ended up in New York City during the Harlem Renaissance. The Harlem Renaissance, if you skip forward, just onto slide number 5, the Harlem Renaissance was an absolutely huge, cataclysmic, social, literary, historical, cultural, musical phenomenon in the 1920s to 1940s in Harlem in New York. I don't know if any of you have been lucky enough to go to Harlem, but it's a beautiful part of New York. This was the Jazz Age. This was an African-American movement. This was very much about putting Black forms of experiment and culture onto that map and really sort of making sure that they were, I mean, this was a culture, it wasn't necessarily it's hard to explain. It wasn't as if the Harlem Renaissance worked against predominantly white constructions of literary modernism and things like that. It just kind of worked in its own way. You know, it was its own thing. It was an incredible movement. I really would urge all of you to kind of look into it more deeply. Harlem was, of course, still is a borough in New York City. It's the epicenter of the Renaissance. In the 1910s, the Great Migration saw thousands of African Americans moving up to New York City, of course, from the southern states. So with World War I, thousands of jobs were kind of becoming more available to those who wanted them. Harlem became an area associated with cheap living costs and better job prospects than other places, hence people moved up there. And of course, Zora Neale Hurston was one of the people who actually took part in this Harlem Renaissance. So we can think of her writing as a part of this movement. So Sweat then, if you look at slide 8, Sweat, the short story Sweat, actually appeared in what we call a little magazine. Now, little magazines are the best type of literature ever. They are literary texts that contain lots and lots of different other forms of literary texts. So poems, short stories, reviews, advertisements. And the little magazine in which the short story Sweat appeared was one called Fire magazine. Fire was a Harlem Renaissance periodical. If you skip to slide 5, you will see a lovely image of, it's just a beautiful magazine. Can you see it's black and red? It looks almost tribal in its prints. It's got the 2 exclamation marks. Fire was an incredible magazine. Unfortunately, Fire only lasted one issue. We talked about this, we touched on this in class. Fire, the little office that the editors of Fire had got together and worked hard to sustain. The editors, by the way, being Langston Hughes, Zora Neale Hurston, Wallace Thurman, Aaron Douglas, Richard Bruce Nugent, who else? Gwendolyn Bennett, John P. Davis. These are all editors of Fire. They edited it together. They worked very, very hard to kind of build this first copy of the magazine, only to have their headquarters in New York burned down after one issue. There's definitely a racial issue to that. You know, this was seen as a threat. This magazine was something of a threat to comfortable, middle-class, white America, and it had to go. And that's what happened, according to people of that mindset. So Fire was destroyed rather appallingly. But let's look at what we do have. Let's look at this document that does kind of remain. Fire was conceived to express kind of the African-American experience during the Renaissance. It was very modernistic. It was realistic. It had stories about real people in it, you know, people who you could relate to. If you were an African-American reader, you'd see yourself in the stories, perhaps, or you might see a version of the society that you knew. You would see edgy kind of cutting-edge issues talked about, homosexuality, interracial marriages, promiscuity, prostitution, prejudice, you know, all the big things in society that kind of make it go round, but some people, you know, we can't talk about, or things that were considered taboo. Fire, of course, the name in itself, if you think about it, what a fire is, it's to create something that, you know, explodes. And this is what this magazine did. It exploded onto the streets of Harlem. Langston Hughes, of course, famous poet, African-American as well, he wrote that the name was intended to symbolize that the goal was, quote, to burn up a lot of the old, dead, conventional, I'm not going to read that word because I don't want to, but something white ideas, you can see it on the PowerPoint, of the past, into a realization of the existence of the younger writers and artists, and provide us with an outlet for publication not available in the limited pages of the small something word magazines then existing. You get the idea. This is something that the limited pages of existing magazines for Black readers did not cater to. This was a new audience. You know, this is for those who wanted to have intellectual kind of cutting edge debates about things that perhaps were not normally talked about. So that's the context in which Zora Neale Hurston's story Sweat appears. A controversial kind of incendiary context in every way. Let's actually think about Sweat a little bit more. So if you haven't now, if you're at this point in the PowerPoint, you think, oh, I haven't read Sweat, I'm going to stop you there and let you read Sweat. That's probably the best idea. Have a little read of Sweat. It's a fantastic story. And I'd like to just suggest in the next kind of couple of minutes, a couple of ways that we might read it. The first one on slide 9, theory and practice. Isla Duncan's social class in Alice Munro's Hired Girl and Sunday Afternoon. I've asked you to have a look at this essay in your literary theory textbook because it's not about Sweat, but it's about how we can look at social class in a short story. So Isla Duncan argues that Munro's short story offers a, quote, social commentary of contemporary society. Now, if you think about it, Zora Neale Hurston does the same with Sweat. And just because Isla Duncan's talking about a different story doesn't mean you can't apply it to Zora Neale Hurston's writing. So you could say, oh, well, look, you know, just as Isla Duncan's argued that Alice Munro creates a certain social commentary through her use of Marxist ideas, so too does Zora Neale Hurston. Now, something that we can look at here, look at this quote in bold. The story is told by an extra-diegetic narrator, but there are several occasions when Alva becomes the subject of focalization from other points of view. So what I want you to think about here is, when does Delia become focalized through other characters in Sweat? How is her character constructed? This is narrative theory, a little bit of narrative theory. How, through the technique of focalization, do we focus on Delia, but without actually ever really hearing Delia's words? If you think about it, Sweat is narrated in the I'll let you think about what person Sweat's narrated in. I won't do all of the work, but Sweat's narrated in a certain person style of narratorial kind of narration that kind of asks us to think about looking at Delia from the outside rather than from the inside. And yet at times through other characters, we see the inside of her character almost. This is called focalization, and you can apply that technique. Have a look at the quote here. The authority of the employer and the passivity of the employee are reflected in the syntax. This is a great quote. Again, this is about Isla Duncan's essay on Alice Munro's Hired Girl. But have a look at how we can see Delia as a similar character to the narrator of Hired Girl. The passivity of the employee is reflected in the syntax. Syntax, sentence structure. If you have a sentence structure that is subject, verb, object, I hit the dog, hopefully not, but I am the subject, hit is the verb, object is the dog. That's a normal way in which we create sentences. So Alice walked to her job. Alice, job, walked. If we have lots of sentences that say things like the job came down hard on Alice, or the job kind of felt like it had hard hours, or if we think of a sentence like, I'm trying to think of a better one, there's plenty of examples in Sweat, but if we think of sentences where it almost makes it seem like the subject of the sentence is negated, we can argue that that's Marxist in a way. Just as the subject is negated in society, they are also negated syntactically. Syntactically means of sentence structures, in the sentence structure, okay? So these are just some ways that we can start thinking about Marxism in Sweat. But what I really want to think about is, how is Sweat Marxist? The best way you can start to apply some of Marx's ideals are to think about the work that we did in the previous lecture. Go back to lecture 1 from Tuesday. Have a look at those main ideas. Do you remember the division of town and country, the division of labour, the resistance to class structures? We can see so many examples of this in Sweat. If you haven't had a chance to read Sweat properly, read it through now with this in mind, and I think you'll find so many examples. But your job as the reader is to specifically tie these examples to parts of Marxist theory, to specific tenets of Marxist theory, such as the division of labour into town and country, and to find concrete examples of that in your text. That is what you're going to be doing for the rest of today, pretty much. What I'd like you to do for the rest of this kind of virtual online lesson, read through Sweat, find some examples of Marxist theories or thoughts or specific policies, I guess you can say, in the text. Write them down, and when you finish, you might just decide you want to use it for assignment 2A. Now, for the rest of your kind of tasks this week, you really need to be focusing on assignment 2A. Remember, you do need to have that done quite soon. You don't have a kind of limitless time with that one, so do be focusing on that. Do use the rest of this week. Remember, we don't have a reading quiz, so do use the rest of this week just to get your reading for next week done as well. So that's Feminism and Gender Studies. We've got Rivkin and Ryan's Introduction. We've got Gail Rubin's The Traffic in Women. And then we have an essay by Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, which is called The Epistemology of the Closet. I'd like you to do those. But that's pretty much it for today. Really get to grips with Sweat, the short story. That's all I really need from you today. Start thinking about how you can see those Marxist or kind of Marxism-inspired ideas or doctrines running through the text, and start to mark them out, okay? That's pretty much it. I'm going to be seeing you next week again in this virtual format for the feminism lecture. That one's going to be a little bit more in depth because it's the first lecture, it's the Tuesday. I've got lots of things I need to run through. But just for today, this little 15-minute lecture I think should suffice. If you do have any questions, as usual, just let me know. Send me an email, drop me a line. We can do virtual office hours, especially as you're preparing for assignment 2A. So again, let me know if there's anything at all that you need, and I will help you straight away. If you email me, I'm currently working on pretty much being back to everyone within about half an hour of your email. So don't be shy, okay? Get on with assignment 2A, and I will reconvene with you next Tuesday for Feminism and Gender Studies. Thank you.